This night, we're stepping into a time when survival wasn't guaranteed by doctors or hospitals, but by luck, stubbornness, and whatever herbs or heated iron happened to be nearby. A simple cut could spell disaster, and a broken bone could change the course of a life. So wherever you are, lying in bed, stretched on a couch, or drifting in a hammock, settle in, because tonight survival itself hangs by a thread. The easiest way to die in the Middle Ages was to fall in battle. The hardest way was to survive it. One stroke of a blade could open you up, and that was the end. Clean, almost merciful in its speed. But crawling out of the mud alive, or being hauled there half-conscious by men swearing at the weight of your armor, that was a sentence of its own. Survival was rarely glory. It was groaning through a mouth full of dirt while someone decided whether to pull you clear or leave you as crow food. Knights had a better chance, though not for noble reasons. Armor was worth money. So was ransom. Two squires dragging their master away knew they weren't just saving a man. They were protecting an investment. If you were a farmer conscripted with a pitchfork, your comrades might try to help, or they might strip your boots and pray for you on the spot. One man's life was a business deal, another's was a burden. The wounds themselves spoke in their own brutal language. A shallow cut to the arm, something that bled bright but missed the vein, might be survivable with nothing more than cloth and luck. A spear in the thigh could go either way. If the artery was spared, you limped for the rest of your life. If not, you were gone in minutes. A dent in the skull could leave you seeing double for weeks, talking to shadows, or worse, sliding into silence by morning. And a belly wound was all but a death sentence, the intestines spilling filth no healer's hand could put right. Soldiers knew this, and sometimes, seeing a comrade gutted, they didn't bother to carry him. Mercy was letting him go. But every so often, the dice rolled differently. A knight with an arrow through the shoulder might be dragged out, pale but breathing. A peasant with a crushed leg might wake in the rear lines, staring at the sky, not dead yet. And, not dead yet, was enough reason to try. That was medicine's foundation. Still breathing? Then we bind, we pour, we pray. Not breathing? Take his boots. Imagine it. You're dropped onto the grass behind the lines. The clash of steel is distant now, muffled by the sound of men moaning, priests chanting, and flies already thick in the air. The smell is iron and sweat, layered with the sharp bite of wine sloshed into wounds. You've survived one lottery only to enter another. Whether infection sets in, whether fever takes you, whether the healer's hands are steady or trembling with exhaustion. Examination, in the way we understand it now, hardly existed. No careful listening, no quiet checking of a pulse. A medieval surgeon looked at you, touched where it hurt, and judged by how much blood poured out. If you twitched when he pressed, it was a good sign. If you didn't, he moved on to the next man. Bodies were plentiful, time was not. And yet, people did live. They lived with scars carved like rivers down their arms, with ribs that healed crooked and jabbed their lungs every winter, with stumps bound in cloth and crutches carved from green wood. They lived not because medicine was kind, but because their bodies were stubborn. Those who healed carried their wounds like a second face, marks that told every passerby, this man fell once and stood up again. But before the scars, before the limp, came the first crude act of care, stopping the bleeding. A boy with torn linen in his hands. A gulp of ale pressed to your lips. A strip of cloth tied tighter and tighter until you felt the world swimming. Not healing, not curing, just holding on long enough to see if your body would bargain with death for another day. And that was where survival truly began, in the rough, stinging moment when a strip of fabric, pulled tight by someone's shaking fingers, decided whether you lived long enough to face the pain that came after. The battlefield had already decided whether you lived or died. Now the question was how badly you had to suffer to stay among the living. The first step was the dressing. Not the kind with herbs and careful stitching, but the crude miracle of pressing cloth into blood until the flow slowed down. The tools were never fine. Sometimes it was a strip torn from a shirt, sometimes the edge of a linen sack. Rarely was it clean. Clean was a luxury word, whispered in monasteries, not in the mud of a battlefield. If wine or ale was on hand, it might be poured over the cloth before it was tied down. Not to soothe the wound, but to sting it so fiercely the healer could believe something was being chased away. The patient would scream, curse, or faint, and the boy pressing the cloth would mutter a prayer as though pain itself was proof of success. And this was where status revealed itself again. A knight might have his wounds bound by a surgeon trained in guild practice, his cloth boiled in wine, his bandage tied neatly with practiced hands. A peasant might have his gash wrapped by another farmer whose hands still smelled of manure. Both had the same chances of infection. The body did not respect rank once it had been opened. It was never just the blood. Bones cracked beneath the skin swelled like loaves left too long in the oven. Flesh turned dark and tight if the bandage was pulled wrong. Sometimes a man survived the cut but died from the cloth tied too cruelly. Sometimes the bleeding slowed, only for the wound to fester, swelling with pus until the fever did the work the sword had begun. A dressing was never a cure. It was a pause, a wager. And yet, for many, that pause was all that was needed. If the bleeding stopped, if the air did not stink too foul by the next morning, there was a chance. Men who should have been dead were propped against tavern walls months later, scars twisting their flesh like badly sewn seams. Women in villages nursed their husbands with poultices of yarrow and sage laid over the crude bandages, hoping the earth's green offerings could finish what linen had only started. The stories that survived were not of those who died quickly, but of those who limped on. A man who lost half a hand might still plow, binding the stump in cloth and learning to grip differently. Another, whose bandage had left a crooked leg, might walk with a stick for the rest of his life. In towns and markets their scars became lessons. People whispered when they saw a crooked limb, or a bandaged stump, he lived through it. Not healed. Not whole. Just alive. And in every story of survival was that moment in the mud, when cloth was pressed, and the bleeding slowed, and a man learned that living was sometimes worse than dying. But a cut or gash was one thing. An arrow was another beast entirely. Would an iron stuck deep inside the flesh force the cruel choice, whether to push it through, or cut it out? Arrows were the great equalizer. A noble in plate, a peasant in wool, it made little difference if the shaft found its mark. They whistled out of the sky with no warning, fell like iron rain, and left wounds that mocked every attempt at easy healing. A sword cut could be wrapped. A spear thrust might be stanched. But an arrow, lodged deep in the body, turned men into puzzles, and the surgeon's hands into gambler's dice. The dilemma was always the same. Do you push the arrow all the way through, snapping the shaft and driving the head out the other side? Or do you cut down into the flesh, dig it out, and risk tearing what the iron hasn't already ruined? Either way, the odds were cruel. Pushed through, the arrow might shred muscle or vein on the way. Cut out, the surgeon's knife could open new pathways for infection, or lose the iron head altogether, leaving it buried inside like a time bomb waiting for fever. On the ground, men learned to hate the moment when the surgeon bent over them with a frown, weighing the choice. The wounded man would stare at his own arm or thigh, watching the skin swell around the shaft, and wonder whether to pray for quick death or for steady hands. Sometimes a friend was ordered to hold him down, or he was given a stick to bite while the decision was carried out. The sound of it was unforgettable, the wet crunch of flesh as the point was forced further in, or the scrape of a blade working its way to the metal hidden within. There were attempts to be clever. Some arrowheads were barbed, designed to tear if pulled back the way they came. For these, special tools were sometimes used, long narrow tongs meant to grip the head and draw it clean. But most of the time there was no such luxury. A battlefield surgeon used what he had, a knife, his hands, and a prayer. Many men died not from the initial strike but from the treatment itself. And yet, astonishingly, some lived. A shaft through the shoulder might be forced out, the wound bound in wine-soaked cloth, and the man left groaning but alive. A thigh puncture, if the great artery was missed, could heal enough for a limp. Even chest wounds sometimes spared the lungs, leaving the man scarred and weakened but still among the living. Those who carried arrow scars were grim teachers, showing the young what survival looked like: puckered flesh, stiff limbs, stories told by firelight of the day when death sat beside them and decided to wait. The poor bore it differently from the rich. A knight might have his arrow drawn out in a tent, with a surgeon muttering Latin and assistants pressing clean cloth. A peasant might endure the same agony in a field, a neighbor's knife serving as scalpel, the bandage torn from a tunic that still smelled of sweat. The body didn't care about the difference. The fever came, or it didn't. The wound festered, or it closed. Fate was no respecter of coin. What was most feared was not the pain, but the silence that followed. A man screaming had a chance. A man who grew quiet, eyes unfocused as the blood continued to seep, that was the one everyone stopped looking at. Arrows taught soldiers to dread stillness more than shouting. And after the arrow came out, the long road began, days of fever, nights of shaking, the wound packed and rewrapped, flies buzzing at the edge of the cloth. If you lived, you might spend the rest of your life rubbing the scar when the rain came, remembering the moment the surgeon made his choice. But not all wounds could be left open. Some had to be closed, even crudely, with thread and trembling hands under the flicker of firelight. At some point, cloth and pressure were not enough. Flesh that gaped had to be closed, or it would never knit, never keep the filth out. And so the surgeon reached for the needle. Firelight flickered, shadows stretched long across canvas walls, and a trembling hand prepared to make one wound in order to mend another. Needles were not delicate things. They were bone, bronze, or iron, thick enough to be seen even in dim light. The thread was gut or coarse linen, boiled in wine if fortune smiled. Few men lying on their backs cared about such details. They cared about the sting of steel pressing through skin that had already been torn open. Stitches were survival's second cruelty. The first was the wound, the second was the cure. No opium. No morphine. Sometimes a swallow of strong ale or wine, sometimes a stick to bite. The sound was worse than the pain. A wet popping as the needle pierced, a scrape as it dragged thread behind it. Surgeons didn't sew neatly, they sewed quickly. The edges of flesh were pulled together like rough cloth, puckering and uneven, but at least they met. A crooked scar meant life. A clean wound left open meant rot. It was not always successful. Men died screaming on the table, their bodies convulsing as the needle worked. Some wounds closed only to swell days later, pus seeping through the stitches. But some lived. And those who did carried the surgeon's mark forever, thick, twisting seams across arms, thighs, bellies. In taverns, men rolled up sleeves not just to show strength, but to show the proof of survival, scars stitched like crude embroidery by hands that had learned their craft through endless repetition. Nobles received the same treatment as peasants, though the setting differed. A lord was sown in a tent, furs beneath him, a priest murmuring nearby. A farmer was sown in a hut, straw beneath him, children watching with wide eyes. The pain was identical. Flesh did not bow to rank. Stitches bit the rich as cruelly as the poor. And yet, there was something strange in those moments by firelight. The surgeon's face, gaunt and weary, leaning close. The patient's breath hot and ragged. Around them, silence broken only by the hiss of the hearth, the cough of another wounded man, the slow pull of thread through skin. Time bent, stretched, and for a moment both men knew the truth. Survival was no noble thing. It was ugly, crooked, and bought with agony. Still, men endured it. Some clenched their teeth until their jaws ached. Some wept openly. Some laughed, half mad from the drink, jeering at death with every stitch. And in the end, when the last knot was tied and the wound was bound again, there was a fragile, ridiculous hope that perhaps the body would heal. That perhaps tomorrow would still arrive. But not every wound could be sewn. Some bled too freely, too wide, too jagged. For those, there was only one tool left, the iron, heated until it glowed red, pressed to flesh until blood and life hissed together in smoke. When stitches failed, when blood refused to listen, there was one remedy left, fire. Not warm, comforting fire, but the kind that turned iron into a brand. A strip of metal laid in the coals until it glowed dull red, then bright, humming with heat. The surgeon did not announce it, not loudly. He simply asked for strong arms to hold the patient still. Everyone knew what was coming. Cauterization was terror dressed as medicine. The wounded man's eyes widened when he saw the blade drawn from the fire, trembling in tongs. Some begged, some cursed, some thrashed against the grips of comrades pinning their shoulders. A swallow of wine might be offered, but no drink on earth was strong enough to soften what came next. The smell came first. Before the iron touched flesh, before the scream tore loose, there was already a warning, that sharp, sour scent of heated metal, of danger. And then it came down, hissing, spitting sparks against the wound. Flesh sizzled like meat on a pan, smoke curled up in threads, and the cry that followed was not human in its pitch. Men who had roared on battlefields wailed like children, kicking against the earth, choking on their own breath. To bystanders it was unbearable, and yet familiar. Those outside the tent would look away, mutter prayers, or pretend not to hear. But everyone heard. The hiss, the scream, the silence that followed. For some, silence was the worst part. If the man stopped crying, stopped moving, there was a moment of terrible uncertainty. Had the fire saved him, or killed him? Surgeons swore by it. Fire was pure, they said. It sealed what cloth could not, chased away rot, closed the gates of the body against filth. Sometimes it worked. The bleeding slowed, the wound crusted black, and the man lived on, scarred but whole enough to limp away. Sometimes it didn't. The shock was too much, the body gave up, and death came anyway, leaving only the smell of burned flesh in the air. The marks of fire lasted forever. A man who had been cauterized carried the brand of survival, dark, puckered flesh, round scars like coins pressed into skin. They were ugly, grotesque even, but they meant life. In taverns, men pointed to them as proof they had stared at hell and come back. In villages, children shuddered at the sight of them, whispering that such scars looked more like punishments than cures. And still, it was better than the alternative. Better to walk with the memory of fire than to be left in the mud, bled white and forgotten. Cauterization was brutal, crude, often lethal, but it was the line between burial and another dawn. And for those who survived the iron, the next hope came not from fire or steel, but from the garden, the quiet hands that gathered leaves and roots, and crushed them into healing pastes beneath the cloister walls. At dawn the garden is all breath and bees. Wattle fences hold back the wind. Low beds make neat squares of green and gray. Sage fir looks silver with dew. Comfort stands like little umbrellas. Yarrow feathers out in pale lace. A nun in a brown habit moves between them with a basket and a knife that's been sharpened too many times. She walks heel-toe, so the wet doesn't soak through, and every step releases scent, thyme crushed under her sandal, a bitter thread of rue, the clean bite of rosemary. If it grows here, someone swears it helps something: pain, swelling, fever, grief. You are not in the garden. You are on the other side of the wall, in the infirmary where the stone sweats and the straw pallets remember other bodies. They have propped you near a small window so the air can turn, and you can hear the bees like a soft, stubborn prayer. Your bandage is dark at the edges. The skin around it shines, pulled angry. When you breathe, your ribs complain in the particular way cracked things complain. She brings the garden to you in handfuls. Leaves rolled in her palm, roots washed in a basin where the water goes brown and then clear again, bundles folded into cloth and tied with twine that smells faintly of smoke. On the table, a mortar smoothed with years, a wedge of tallow, a little pot of rendered fat, a jar where oil sits the color of weak sun. Beside them, the herb book lies open, ink drawings like ghosts of plants, notes in a hand that once was careful and is now quick. Someone before her copied these recipes, someone after will copy hers. There is a sequence she trusts. First, warm water. A cloth wrung nearly dry, then pressed around the wound until the muscles stop arguing and the skin remembers it can soften. Sometimes they use wine instead, strong, stinging, the scent of the vineyard turned into a kind of courage. If there is vinegar, a few drops, to sour what should sour. Clean is not a promise, it is a direction of travel. Then the green work. Yarrow for the bleeding, planted to pull out what has no business being in flesh. Comfrey, nidbone, ground to a cool paste that smells of the riverbank. The pestle lifts and falls, thud, turn, thud, and her hands go the color of the leaves. She mixes the crushed herb with warm fat, melts in a shaving of beeswax so it will sit where it's put, and spreads it with a wooden spatula that has learned this curve 100 times. The poultice goes on like a second skin, the linen over it like a small promise. Pain lives here openly. They do not banish it, they negotiate. A mouthful of poppy tea if they have it, just enough to blur the edges. Willow bark when the weather threatens fever in the bones. If you were a lord, there might be better wine, a softer pillow, a curtain between you and the coughing across the room. But the leaf does not care for titles, and neither does the body. A peasant can sleep as deeply as a baron if the dose is right. Between dressings the days are slow. The garden dictates the rhythm. Harvest at dawn before the sun steals the oils. Dry on racks when the air is kind. Hang bundles from the rafters when it is not. In the afternoon she checks your pulse by holding your wrist and watching your face more than the vein. She smells for the sweet sour that warns of rot, listens for the rattle that says the lungs are joining the argument. There is humor here too, small and dry. If the bees complain, she says once, you're getting better. They prefer the living. Sometimes men arrive who will not keep what nature gave them. A crushed hand becomes 3 fingers in a lifetime of buttoning badly. A leg that will not set becomes a stump wrapped clean, a crutch carved from ash. A new way of walking that works only if pride is light enough to carry. The garden cannot grow a limb, but it can keep the rest of you in the world long enough to learn it again. At night the infirmary settles into a shared breathing. Candles smolder. The stone gives back the day's cool. Somewhere a novice snores like a saw. You count pains to pass the hours, sharp, dull, distant, near, and discover the quiet ones are worst. Fever comes like a tide and goes. When it recedes, the bandage is lighter. When it rises, everything tastes of copper. She sits you up when you cough so the ribs don't catch. She tucks the blanket at your feet as if warmth itself were a medicine. You do not ask how long. In this place time is measured by the garden. The day the comfort runs low. The morning the yarrow blooms again. the week the first frost nips the lavender and the still room smells of bundled summer. If you live, you will remember the exact feel of rosemary between your fingers and the way sage leaf looks like a small green ear, listening for your breath. There are limits the wall cannot keep out. Some wounds go dark at the edges no matter what is pressed against them. Some bellies swell with a stubbornness no book can argue with. For those, she has only the litany of touch, wash, bind, comfort, witness. Not every life can be pulled back by roots and patience. But many are, surprisingly many, and those who return to the world carry a quiet debt to soil and water and the hands that move between them. When the dressing is changed that evening, the skin under it is less angry. The heat in the flesh is not so loud. She nods as if a bargain has been struck and reaches, at last, for a small clay pot kept at the back of the shelf, sealed with wax against ants and time. The lid warms in her palm, the scent rises before you see the gold inside. Not wine now, not leaf, but something the bees made while the world was busy hurting itself, thick and bright, sweet enough to make rot think twice. A clay pot is lifted from the shelf like a secret. Its lid is sealed with wax, the outside sticky where summer fingers left their mark. When the nun breaks it open, the scent rises first, sweet, heavy, golden, as if the sun itself has been poured into a jar and hidden away. It looks absurd against the backdrop of groaning men and soiled bandages. Honey, of all things, in a place of rot and blood. And yet this was one of the few medicines trusted across centuries, thick enough to seal, sharp enough to fight what the eye could not see. The patient does not smile when it is applied. Warm liquid running into torn flesh does not comfort. It stings, it bites, it wakes the nerve endings already raw from iron and thread. He jerks, curses under his breath, and the nun simply presses her palm flat to keep the bandage in place until the honey holds. She does not apologize. Pain is not the enemy here, rot is. They believed, with reason, that honey could draw poison out, could keep a wound from turning black at the edges. It was not just folk hope. Even in distant lands, physicians praised it, and crusaders carried jars home with as much reverence as relics. To peasants, it was harder to find. Honey cost dearly in towns, unless you kept bees yourself and were lucky enough not to have them stolen in a raid. For the poor, wounds were more likely packed with moss, or ash, or left to their own stubbornness. But when honey was used, survival had a sweetness all its own. The wound sealed under it did not look noble. Flesh oozed against gold, linen stuck and had to be peeled away, taking hair and scabs with it. Still, those treated with honey often walked again. They carried sticky scars, pale but alive. Children poked fun at the smell lingering on their skin. Neighbors muttered that they were half bee now, charmed or cursed. But the men themselves learned to rub the scar with pride, a quiet reminder that they had tasted sweetness at the edge of death. Honey was also food for hope. A wounded man who could not stomach meat or broth might lick the corner of the jar, sugar sparking in his mouth after days of bitterness. For a moment, fever softened. The sweetness was not just medicine, it was memory of life before the cut, before the fire, before the days when everything tasted of iron. And so, in convents and villages alike, honey was kept close. It was smeared on burns, on arrows' kisses, on the cracks of wintered lips. The bees did not know their work saved soldiers as much as it sweetened ale, but the wounded knew. And the healers knew too. Whenever a man walked back into the world with honey still crusting his bandages, he carried the proof of survival that was as ordinary as bread, and just as miraculous. Yet not every wound was clean, no matter how sweet the cure. Some injuries twisted bones instead of flesh, bent limbs out of shape until nothing golden could knit them straight. And when that happened, survival depended on hands strong enough, and merciless enough, to wrench a body back into place. In the Middle Ages, a broken bone was not mended by doctors in gowns and gloves. It was set by hands that smelled of smoke and wool, hands that had fixed sheep legs and cart wheels, and knew the sound of things snapping back into place. These were the bone setters, and if you were lucky, one lived close enough to hear your cries. The moment began with recognition. Everyone knew what a broken limb looked like: the twisted angle, the swelling that rose too fast, the skin stretched tight and shiny. There was no doubt, no pretending it was just a bruise. A man with a broken leg could not stand. A man with a broken arm held it like a bird with a snapped wing. The only question was whether anyone had the strength, and the cruelty, to put it right. The patient was not asked for permission, only for endurance. A bite stick between the teeth, or if fortune smiled, a cup of ale so strong it blurred the edges of vision. Sometimes two neighbors held the shoulders, another gripped the ankle, and the bone setter placed his hands at the site of the break. He pressed, he felt, he found the ridge where straightness had given way to ruin. And then he pulled. The sound was unforgettable. A wet crunch, a pop, a shudder through the whole body as bone slid back into its cradle. The man screamed or went silent, the neighbors cursed, the bone setter grunted with effort and relief. There was no gentleness in it, but there was precision. Too much pull and the bone would shear again. Too little and it would heal crooked, leaving the man limping forever. Splints were fashioned from whatever lay at hand: willow sticks, narrow boards, even reeds bound with strips of linen or wool. Moss or straw padded the gaps. The limb was wrapped until it looked more like a log than flesh, bound tight but not so tight that the skin turned pale. Bone setters had no clocks, only eyes and instincts. They checked for blood the way bakers check dough, by touch, by warmth, by color. For ribs, there was little to do. The chest was bound with long bands of cloth, tight enough to keep the bones from shifting, loose enough to let breath pass. For fingers, thin splints tied with thread. For jaws, sometimes a leather strap to hold it shut until speech and chewing returned. Every injury was an improvisation, and every improvisation carried risk. Not all patients healed clean. Many bones set in those days knitted crooked, leaving arms that bent strangely, legs shorter than their partners, backs hunched from fractures that were never truly tamed. But crooked was better than dead. A man who limped could still plow. A woman with a twisted wrist could still knead bread. And scars and angles became part of the body's story, as much a mark of survival as of injury. Status shaped the scene, but only in comfort. A knight might be set on furs, a peasant on straw. A noble might have splints carved smooth by a carpenter, a farmer might have rough sticks bound with twine. Yet the pain was the same. Flesh and bone did not respect coin, and the cry of a baron under the bone setter's hands was no different from the cry of a plowman. And there was always the shadow of failure. Sometimes the swelling never eased. Sometimes fever took hold, and the limb blackened. Sometimes the bone refused to knit, leaving the patient crippled for life. And sometimes, when the injury was too close to the skull, the bone setter knew his hands could not save. Then a different, more dreadful tool was called for, one that opened the head itself to let out the death pressing within. When the break was in the skull, the bone setter's hands were not enough. A cracked arm could be bound, a broken leg splinted. But when the head swelled, when a man's speech slurred, his eyes rolled, or he vomited without end, everyone knew something inside was pressing to get out. And in the Middle Ages, there was only one way to relieve it. They called it trepanning. It did not happen in fine halls. It happened under rafters, where beams dripped pitch, and the floor smelled of straw and damp earth. The patient was laid flat on a bench or table. Sometimes his family stood by, muttering prayers, crossing themselves each time he groaned. Sometimes they left, unable to watch. He was given wine, if there was any, or nothing at all. Numbness was a luxury the century had not invented. The tools were not elegant. A carpenter's chisel, a hand drill, even a knife sharpened for the task. Surgeons who were fortunate owned a special trepan, a crown-shaped bit of iron turned by a wooden handle, biting into bone with each slow twist. Those less equipped used whatever was near. The skull, for all its strength, yielded in time to patience and force. The sound was worse than the sight. A gritty scrape, a hollow knocking as steel pressed bone, then a sudden softness when the barrier thinned. The patient whimpered, sometimes screamed, sometimes lay eerily still, eyes glassy and unfocused. Neighbors held his arms and legs, whispering encouragement, or muttering that he was already halfway gone. The air filled with the smell of iron and sweat, sharp and close. And then, relief. The pressure eased. Sometimes blood flowed, sometimes clear fluid leaked, sometimes only a plug of bone was lifted away, small and terrible in the surgeon's palm. The man beneath might gasp, shudder, even speak a little more clearly than before. Not all survived, but enough did that trepanning became a dark kind of hope, repeated through centuries, across countries, in huts, monasteries, and battlefields. Afterward, the wound was dressed like any other. Cloth soaked in wine, herbs packed against the raw circle. Honey, if it could be spared, poured in to keep the rot at bay. A cap of leather or cloth bound over the hole, sometimes filled with wax or metal to shield the soft spot left behind. And then it was up to the body. Some men healed and lived for years with the gap. Others faltered within days, fever claiming them, or silence closing in forever. What it meant to survive was strange. To live with a piece of skull missing was to live more carefully. Helmets never fit quite right again. Rain stung on the tender spot. Cold pierced deeper. Headaches came faster. And yet, survival was survival. Men returned to their work, women to their children, carrying the mark of the trepan as proof that death had been cheated, if only for a time. For the poor, such operations were whispered about in awe and fear. To cut into the head seemed like sacrilege, as if opening the vessel where thought and soul lived. But desperation overruled taboo. When the choice was certain death or a chisel under the rafters, families chose the chisel. The wealthy faced it too, though theirs were performed with cleaner tools, steadier hands, candles and brass holders instead of tallow drips. The outcome was still the same gamble. Money could buy skill, but not certainty. Trepanning lingered for centuries because sometimes, against reason, it worked. Men who should have died rose from their pallets, weak but breathing. And when they did, neighbors spoke of miracles, of God's hand guiding the blade. The surgeon himself said little. He only wiped his tools, washed the bone dust from his hands, and prepared for the next body laid before him. And when the skull was closed and the patient lay quiet, the healer reached again for the simplest of medicines, a jug of wine, tipped not into the mouth, but straight into the wound, searing like fire, trusted to wash away what could not be seen. Wine was not only for feasts or prayers. In the sickroom, in the makeshift infirmary, in the shadow of rafters where a man moaned on straw, it was medicine. Crude, burning, blunt medicine, but sometimes that was enough. The jar was heavy, its rim dark from years of pouring. The liquid inside was red or white depending on fortune, sour if it had been kept too long, sharp if it came straight from the cask. To the wounded, it did not matter. Wine was brought not to cheer the heart but to sting the flesh. The ritual was always the same. Bandages loosened, the wound exposed. Flesh raw, sometimes gaping, sometimes stitched with crooked thread. Then the jug tipped, and the stream fell. At first it was only a sound, a glug, a splash, a soaking. Then came the sting. The man on the pallet arch, teeth bared, hands clawing at straw. The liquid seemed to bite deeper than steel had cut. He spat curses, sometimes begged, sometimes bit down so hard his jaw cracked. The healer smiled grimly, for a scream was a sign of life. Why wine? Because it was clean enough, when water was not. Because it washed dirt from wounds, chased rot from the corners where pus lurked. Because it was what they had. In monasteries, jars of vinegar were kept for the same reason, and brine too, but wine had the double virtue of dulling the mind as well as the flesh. A swallow first, then a pour. The body numbed inside and out, in theory at least. It did not always save. Some wounds festered regardless, turning sour no matter how much wine was spilled on them. But many held. Soldiers returned to their ranks with the smell of grapes clinging to their bandages. Peasants returned to fields with stains that made them smell more of tavern than of earth. Children asked why their fathers reeked of drink when they had been too weak to lift a cup. Wine's sting was democratic. A knight howled as loudly as a farmer. A lady's pale arm trembled the same as a servant's. The liquid did not discriminate. And so the healer poured patient after patient, jug after jug, until the floor grew sticky and the air sour sweet. To visitors, it smelled like a tavern-turned-nightmare. To the wounded, it was the difference between decay and the chance to wake tomorrow. But there was another truth to it. After the pouring, after the wound was bound again in fresh cloth, the patient was often given the cup itself. To drink deep, to blur the pain, to fall asleep with the warmth of it in his belly. It was a comfort, rough but real. Wine was medicine both ways, in the flesh and in the throat. It kept men quiet when they might otherwise thrash, it eased fevers, and sometimes, when the wound healed, it gave them stories to tell, that they had survived on nothing more than stitches and wine. Yet once the wine was gone, and the jug set down empty, another silence always came. Fever did not leave so quickly. Men lay waiting, watching their sweat bead, waiting to see if it turned cold and clammy or hot and endless. Wine could only buy time. Survival required something more stubborn, a body willing to hold on while the days crawled by. And so, after the jug was set aside, the wounded stared into the dark, listening to the coughs and groans around them, wondering if their own breath would sound the same tomorrow. Waiting endlessly for the fever to speak its verdict. After the wine, after the bandages were tied and the healer had gone to another pallet, there was nothing left to do but wait. And waiting was often worse than the wound. The fever came like weather. You could not see it at first, only feel the air thicken around your body. Sweat collected at the hairline, slid down into your ears, soaked the straw beneath you until it smelled of salt and damp rot. Your skin burned while your feet turned cold, as if your blood had forgotten its direction. Each cough from the man in the next bed sounded like an omen. If his breathing faltered, you wondered when yours would. Fever was the great judge of wounds in the Middle Ages. A cut, a break, even a hole from an arrow could be survived, but if fever followed, survival was no longer in your hands. The body shook as though it fought something invisible, the lips cracked, the tongue swelled. Dreams came quickly, fever dreams that blurred prayer and memory, where dead comrades leaned close and whispered promises you couldn't quite remember after waking. The healers had little to offer against it. Cool cloths pressed to the brow, vinegar poured sparingly over the skin, herbs steeped into weak teas that tasted of bitterness more than hope. Some prayed aloud, sprinkling holy water over the wound, marking the body with the cross. Others whispered that saints favored the bold, and left a token, a relic, a sliver of bone in a pouch, on the pallet, as if faith itself might lower the heat. Not everyone believed it was illness. To many, fever was punishment, or a test. Men muttered apologies to God in their delirium, confessing sins half remembered. Women clutched rosaries so hard the beads left marks in their palms. Sometimes a priest was called, not to heal but to hear the last words, in case the sweat turned cold and the silence stretched too long. Nights were endless. Candles burned down, replaced, burned down again. Every hour stretched, every breath measured. Some counted by the creak of the rafters, others by the rats that rustled in the straw. The fever rose, fell, rose again, as if the body were a bell being rung by invisible hands. You waited, helpless, until the ringing stopped. Those who survived remembered the moment the heat broke. One dawn, the sweat cooled, the trembling eased, and hunger returned like an old friend. Bread tasted again, water no longer choked. The world sharpened. To open your eyes and see the roof beams without blurring, that was victory. To feel thirst, even pain, was proof you were still among the living. Those who did not survive left in silence. The fever raged until the body was too weak to fight. The straw stayed damp long after the breath stopped. The healer came, checked the pulse, crossed the chest, and moved on. For the survivors on nearby pallets, the lesson was simple: fever spared who it wished. There was no bargaining. And still, in the morning, life continued. The healers rinsed the cloths, fetched more herbs, and bound fresh wounds. The sick room filled again with the sour smell of sweat, the heavy tang of damp linen, the faint sweetness of honey smeared on cuts. For those lying still, the waiting began again. Because after the fever, if you survived it, another ordeal always followed: the smell of the infirmary itself, that mix of rot and breath and straw that marked you as much as the wound ever had. The smell of survival was never clean. If you wanted to know what it was like to live through a wound in the Middle Ages, you did not need to look at the scars. You only needed to breathe. The infirmary was not a hall of marble and light. It was a long room, low-roofed, rafters blackened with soot, windows small enough to make daylight a rumor. Straw pallets lined the walls, each with its own bundle of rags and a body stretched upon them. The air pressed heavy on the chest, thick with a mixture that no candle could chase away. There was the sourness of sweat baked into linen that had been washed and dried a dozen times, yet never lost its stain. The sweetness of honey and herbs ground to paste, sharp and green when first applied, but turning musty as they aged against the flesh. The iron tang of blood, metallic, always present even if no wound was fresh. And beneath it all, the unmistakable hint of rot, the edge of wounds that were not healing, the whisper of death carried in through pores and cloth. It clung to everything. The healers wore it on their gowns, carried it on their hands even after rinsing in buckets of vinegar water. Children who brought food wrinkled their noses and hurried out. Stray cats lingered by the doors, tails twitching, drawn by scents they did not understand. To step into the infirmary was to step into a world where air itself was wounded. For the men and women lying on the pallets, the smell became part of them. At first it was unbearable, gagging, dizzying. But after days and nights of breathing it in, it was the new ordinary. They no longer noticed when the cloth under their heads turned damp, when the bandage stiffened with blood, when the room thickened with groans and whispers. The smell dulled the senses until survival was simply the act of lying still, waiting for the stink to move on to another body. Not all odors were equal. The sharp reek of fresh wine meant a wound had been tended, that life still fought back. The grassy bitterness of yarrow or sage meant a nun had worked the garden that morning, still hopeful. But the sickly sweetness of pus, when it spread too far, silenced the room. That smell was a herald, one that no prayer or poultice could banish. Visitors brought their own air with them, perfumes, smoke from hearths, the outside's cold freshness. For a moment, the contrast stung. A man recovering would breathe deep of it, close his eyes, remember what it felt like to walk beyond these walls. Then the doors shut again, and the infirmary swallowed him back into its breath. Even after leaving, the scent followed. Survivors walked through markets with the faint trace of vinegar and rot clinging to their clothes. People stepped aside, not only from pity but from recognition. Everyone knew that smell. It was the smell of having come close to death and crawled away. And yet, there was always worse. A wound that looked small but grew black, a cut that turned angry and swollen until it spread its odor through the whole room. When that happened, the healers shook their heads, for the stink was stronger than their hands. The infirmary taught a lesson in silence, that not every wound healed, and some carried their own endings. But for every pallet that emptied in mourning, there was another where a man sat up, weak but grinning, the smell of the place clinging to him like a cloak he would never shed. He would walk out into daylight again, carrying it into taverns, into homes, into stories. The infirmary's air was part of survival, as much a mark as any scar. And still, sometimes, the scent warned of the one that would not make it, the wound that worsened despite herbs and honey, despite wine and prayers. At first it was only a change in the bandage. Not the sharp wine smell that meant care, not the green breath of herbs. Something sweeter, heavier. The cloth came away with a sound like tearing parchment, and the skin beneath had gone shiny and hot, the edges of the cut lifting as if the body wanted to spit itself out. Men around you made the same polite face people wear for bad stew. The healer didn't. Her mouth flattened, and she set the cloth down very carefully, as if not to startle the thing growing there. They had hoped for the good kind of pus, the thick, butter-colored stuff that soothed old surgeons into believing the wound was laudable. This was not that. This was thin and gray, then suddenly bright, and it carried a sweetness that made the throat tighten. Fever, which had wandered in and out like a neighbor, came back with its sleeves rolled. The skin streaked red, lines climbing the limb as though they had errands elsewhere. Someone muttered about bad humors. Someone else crossed himself twice for luck. There were steps to follow, even now. Warm cloths. The jug of vinegar brought close and used like a little storm. A lancing, quick and ugly, to let the pressure sigh out. Honey again, because bees do stubborn work, and garlic pounded with onion when someone remembered an old book had sworn by it. The wound argued. It puffed and gleamed, turned the air sour-sweet. Sleep ran from the palate and would not be coaxed back. A day later the jokes died first. The man who had laughed at his own screams during the stitching now stared at the rafters with a stillness that worried everyone. His hand twitched toward the hurt and then back, as if afraid to learn what his fingers already knew. Jaw muscles began to ache. Someone whispered of the bad stiffness, the kind that locked a mouth shut and arched a back until prayer had to shout to be heard over it. They tried to pry teeth apart with a spoon and stopped when the gums bled. Coin made a difference in the clutter of the room, not in the choices. A lord's pallet might be piled with furs, a peasant's was straw over dirt. The barber surgeon came quicker when a steward was waiting with a purse, but the knife he brought was the same knife, and the basin of wine did not care whose name was carved over the door. For both, the talk bent toward the same fork in the road, cut more or cut away. Sometimes the body made the decision. Black crept in from the edges like night tide, and the skin went from hot to curiously cold. Flesh lost its color the way fruit does when forgotten. The room learned a new smell that even the cats at the threshold thought better of. Then the choice was no longer between pain and pain. It was between a smaller grave and a larger one. The talk before the saw was gentle and cruel. Gentle, because voices went soft as if near a cradle. Cruel, because the words themselves had teeth. Keep the limb and die soon, or lose it and maybe see spring. A brother stood with knuckles white around a rosary. A wife smoothed a forehead already slick with fever and nodded in a way that said she knew winter from summer. The patient, if he could speak, asked how a man might hoe with one hand, ride with one leg, be held with less of himself to hold. No one had answers fit for daylight. If the cut was made, the room tightened into a knot of purpose. Leather strap. Poppy tea, if any remained. The tourniquet twisted until the skin beyond went waxy. The saw sang, high, fast, a bright sound that never quite left the ears afterward. Blood came first in a brave rush, and then sulked. The stump steamed. Hot iron hissed to quiet what would not quiet on its own. Honey again, because even in this there was room for sweetness. Linen. Silence. A fly bounced against the window and found nothing to land on. And if the cut was not made, if courage ran out, or coin did, or the family chose to wager the whole man against the odds, the days drew in and folded over themselves. Fever counted them for you. The room measured them in candles and prayers. The streaks reddened, then blurred. Words unraveled on the tongue. Breath turned shallow, that small animal in the chest deciding whether to stay in its trap. Some who refused the saw lived anyway, by sheer contrariness and the luck of a body that changes its mind at the edge. Others slipped, quiet as a hand off a table. Those who came back from the one that got worse did not return to the world the same shape. A stump bound clean needed teaching, how to bear weight without skin splitting, how to pad a socket, how to keep the raw end from knocking the night awake. A mouth that had clenched shut needed coaxing with broths and patience. A limb that healed crooked learned tools anew, a shortened hoe, a stirrup lowered, a wife's arm taken without shame. People in markets stepped aside not out of pity alone, but in recognition. This was someone who had bargained with rot and kept more than nothing. The infirmary's smell followed them home for a long while. Vinegar in the clothes, honey under the nails, a pharmacy of herbs caught in the seams. Children asked to see the scar and were hushed, then shown anyway. Winter found the wound first each year and rang it like a bell. But pain had become a language they could translate most days. On good mornings the world felt possible again, on bad ones it merely felt familiar. And when they were finally strong enough to swing their legs over the pallet, there were tools waiting by the door, ashwood shaved to the hand, a peg dressed in leather, a pair of crutches that clicked like polite footsteps on stone. Crutches were the proof that you had lost and won at the same time. Lost a limb, won the argument with death. They were not elegant things, just two sticks shaved to the right length, sometimes padded with scraps of cloth where they pressed into the armpit. If you were lucky, a carpenter shaped them to fit, smoothing the edges so they didn't rub raw. If you weren't, they were simply branches, rough bark still clinging, and your shirt bore the red marks of where wood had bitten skin. The first steps on them were worse than the wound. Balance was no friend. You swung forward, body pitched like a drunkard, the world tilting as straw or cobbles betrayed you. Every thud of wood on ground echoed like a drum announcing your weakness. Children followed sometimes, whispering, laughing, daring each other to imitate your gait. Some days you wanted to cuff them, other days their laughter was a strange kind of company. Markets saw you differently. Pity in one pair of eyes, respect in another. A woman stepping aside, murmuring a prayer as you passed. A man touching his hat in recognition of the struggle. And always the space that opened in front of you, not too wide, but just enough that people remembered survival had a smell, and they'd caught a whiff of it. You carried the infirmary on your clothes, vinegar, smoke, the faint sweetness of herbs. It marked you even louder than the wooden thump at your sides. Crutches changed the rhythm of life. Every journey was measured twice, once in distance, once in endurance. What a neighbor did in a half hour, you did in an hour and sweat. Stairs were enemies. Mud was treachery. A sudden rain made the wood slick and the ground unforgiving. But you learned tricks. How to plant the sticks before swinging, how to rest with one tucked under the arm and the other like a staff. How to lean on a friend without hating yourself for it. In villages, the sight became familiar, men returning from war with one leg, farmers who'd lost feet to frostbite or tools, old women with hips that had shattered in winter. Crutches were not shame, they were badges. Proof you had lived when others had not. And in a strange way, they made you visible. No one ignored the man with wooden legs clattering down the lane. You were a story every time you moved. There was pride in it too, though it came crooked. To stand upright, to move under your own strength, even hobbled, was to declare that you were not finished. Men at taverns slapped the wood as if it were another comrade. Wives scolded but smiled when their husbands insisted on walking to the fields anyway, sticks digging furrows in the dirt. Some even decorated them, carved initials, tied charms, wrapped leather where hands gripped. A man's life was measured by his tools. Crutches were no different. But they had their toll. Shoulders ached from the constant press. Hands blistered, palms split. At night you lay the sticks beside you and felt their ghost weight even in dreams. Every morning began with the choice, stand again, or let the bed keep you. Survival was never free, it charged a daily rent. And yet, walking on crutches was walking. Better than crawling, better than lying still. Each clack of wood on stone was defiance, a reminder that death had not collected its due. Children grew used to your rhythm. Neighbors adjusted their pace to match. And when you reached the market square at last, sweat on your brow, heart pounding, you stood straighter than any whole man, because you had earned each step with pain. The crutches would always be with you, even after they broke and were replaced. They became part of your outline, your sound, your shadow. The world measured you by them, but also remembered you through them. And in the evenings, when you leaned them against the wall, lowered yourself to the bench, and let your body rest, you could almost laugh at how 2 sticks of wood had turned into your most faithful companions. And still, by the fire, someone always wanted to see the scars beneath, proof not only of how you walked, but of how you had once nearly stopped. Scars in the Middle Ages were not hidden. They were displayed like a kind of second language, written across skin for anyone who cared to read. And when the fire burned low in the tavern, or when winter pressed people close in the hall, there was always one man ready to roll up a sleeve and let the past speak. The scar was never pretty. Jagged, uneven, raised like rope beneath the skin. Sometimes it shone pale as candle wax, other times it stayed angry red, ridged like a badly mended road. But the telling was never about beauty. It was about proof. Proof that steel had kissed you and failed to carry you off. Proof that you had gone to the edge and stumbled back. The veteran would trace it with a finger, slow and deliberate, as if reminding himself of the shape. They said I would never lift a sword again. He might murmur, and then he would lift his mug instead, grinning through crooked teeth. Around him, men leaned in closer, half in awe, half in envy. To have survived was to have gained something rarer than gold, a story that no one could deny. These stories were currency. In markets, a scar across the cheek could win respect without a word. In taverns, a jagged line across the ribs bought silence from younger men who thought themselves brave. Even among lords, scars carried weight, proof of valor, of service, of endurance. Women traced them with careful hands, sometimes with pity, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with desire. But not all scars were badges. Some were burdens. A hand twisted by a bad stitch, a leg healed too short, a back curved like a bow from a wound that never set straight. These veterans laughed the loudest, as if sound could cover the ache that followed every step. Pain was the companion that never left, even when comrades had. Yet they lived, and in living they claimed a kind of victory over the grave. The scarred veteran's story was not just his own. It reminded others of what survival looked like. Farmers looked at the mark and remembered that broken plows could be mended too. Widows touched it and thought of husbands who had not returned. Children stared wide-eyed and learned that men were not immortal, but could be stubborn enough to pretend. Ale helped the telling. Wine, too, when coin allowed. The more he drank, the more the story shifted, sometimes grander, sometimes funnier, sometimes edged with bitterness. He might swear the wound was from a noble duel when it had truly come from a skirmish in the mud. He might claim it was earned in service of a king when it had really been for a stolen sheep. No matter. The scar itself could not lie. And in the silence after laughter, there was always a moment when the scar spoke more than the man. A tightening of the jaw, a glance into the fire, a wince when the old wound ached with the weather. Everyone saw it, even if no one said a word. Scars did not heal just once. They healed again and again. Every day the man woke and carried them. Still, there was pride in survival, even crooked survival. To lift the arm others thought useless, to drink, to eat, to sit among men and women and tell the tale, that was victory. The scar was a map, a marker, a reminder that though life had cut deep, it had not cut enough. And when the telling ended, and the veteran rolled down his sleeve or shifted his cloak, the fire crackled, the mugs clinked, and the room exhaled. Outside, the night was cold, the stars indifferent. But inside, the scarred man sat with warmth on his face and ale in his hand, proof that stories, like wounds, could keep a man alive long after the bleeding stopped. And yet winter waited, and with it, a different kind of trial. Not a slash from steel, but the slow torment of broken ribs that had to mend in cold air. A sword slash healed or it did not. An arrow wound closed or it festered. But a broken rib, that was slower, meaner, a punishment doled out breath by breath. And in winter, when the air itself turned into a blade, it was almost a sentence. There was no binding strong enough to keep the chest still. Healers wrapped strips of cloth round and round, tight until the lungs fought against it, but a man still had to breathe. And every breath was betrayal. Each inhale stabbed, each exhale scraped. Lying down hurt. Sitting up hurt more. Laughing was unthinkable, coughing a cruelty, sneezing an agony so sharp it made grown men cry. Winter made it worse. The cold sharpened every edge of pain. Air rushed in icy and raw, biting the lungs, making them shudder. Fires burned low, and every cough rattled through the hall. People with ribs broken in autumn often prayed for spring, because the cold slowed healing, stretched nights into tortures, turned the simplest act of breathing into a kind of penance. There was little to be done. No surgeon could stitch a rib. No bone setter could wrench it straight. The advice was simple: rest, warmth, patience. But rest was a luxury. Fields still needed tending, wood still needed chopping, animals still needed feeding. A man with broken ribs was told to lie still, yet hunger pushed him up anyway. Each strike of the axe sent fire down his side. Each sack lifted in the barn stole a piece of breath. The body begged to stop, but life never stopped with it. The nights were the cruelest. Straw pallets stiff with frost, blankets thin, wind sneaking through cracks in the walls. You lay awake, counting the splinters of pain with every shift of the chest, listening to your own wheezing echo in the dark. Neighbors turned on their sides to block the sound. Wives placed warm stones at the feet of their husbands and prayed they would last until dawn. Children stared wide-eyed, learning too young that survival was sometimes just the art of holding very still. Some men healed crooked. A rib that knit badly left a permanent hitch in the breath, a catch in the voice, a cough that never left. Others never healed at all, their lungs pierced or filled until breath abandoned them. A broken rib could be a small wound or a slow death, and no one knew which until the weeks dragged by. And yet there was stubbornness. Men still sat at taverns, clutching their sides when they laughed too hard. Women still hauled water, even when every bend to the bucket set fire under the breastbone. They learned to move carefully, to turn like dancers avoiding steps. Pain became a companion that followed into every chore, every prayer, every sigh of wind. Among soldiers, broken ribs were mocked as cowards' wounds, not fatal, not glorious. But among those who endured them, they were curses remembered for life. Old men by the hearth would point to their chest and say, "Here is where winter never left me." And they were not lying. Cold weather brought it back each year, sharp as the day it had first cracked. Still, even broken ribs healed, given enough time and patience. The scar of them was invisible, but no less real. And those who survived carried with them a new reverence for breath, for the simple act of filling lungs and emptying them again. Survival sometimes meant walking, sometimes meant eating. In this case, it meant only one thing: breathing, one painful measure at a time. But not all survivors bore their scars in silence. Some lifted sleeves or tunics to show the jagged lines that marked them, telling stories by the fire of wounds that had once seemed impossible to outlive. Children were not meant to survive wounds in the Middle Ages. Their bodies were too small, their blood too quick to spill, their strength too little to carry fever for long. Most did not. Which is why the ones who did were remembered like miracles. A girl with a bandaged arm played by the well, her laughter high and thin, almost strange after weeks of silence. She had been found after a raid, pulled from the ashes of a barn where her family had fallen. An arrow had torn her arm, a wound that on a grown man would have been bad, but on a child was nearly fatal. Yet she lived. The wound was wrapped in cloth, stiff with dried honey, smelling faintly of herbs. Each movement still hurt, but she could lift the bucket's handle with her other hand, and in the village that was proof enough of life. Survivors like her became symbols. Neighbors pointed them out with a mix of pity and awe. "She is the one who made it," they whispered, and every scar on her skin became part of the story. Children who healed grew up marked, not only in flesh but in the way people looked at them. They carried the memory of whole families who had not been so lucky. The process of healing was crueler for children, because there was little mercy in it. A boy with a broken leg was strapped to splints that weighed more than his frame. He whimpered through the night, the sound muffled by straw, his cries ignored because pain was expected. Another child with burns had honey poured on the blisters, then wrapped so tight the skin beneath suffocated. They did not understand the words of healers or priests. They only understood hurt, endless hurt, and the strange stillness afterward when fever finally left. Some did not live through that stillness. But the ones who did walked with a kind of borrowed light. They were stared at in markets, touched on the head by strangers, blessed twice by priests who saw in them something beyond ordinary survival. They grew up fast, because survival itself made them older than their years. Children carried their scars differently than adults. A missing finger became a curiosity, shown off in games as if it were a trick. A crooked arm turned into a challenge. Could they climb a tree with it, or throw a stone farther than the others? They adapted because they had no choice. Their play folded pain into it, until the scar was not a burden but part of who they were. Adults wept quietly when they saw it. Children only laughed. But laughter had an edge. When winter came and illness returned, it was always the wounded children who sickened first. Their bodies were weaker, their strength never fully restored. Some lived into adulthood, carrying the old wounds like secret companions. Others slipped away in a later season, as if death had only waited politely outside the door. Still, in every village, there were tales of children who endured. A boy who lost an eye in a scythe accident and grew up to guide others across the fields. A girl whose arm never straightened again, yet who spun wool faster than any of her peers. Survival was never clean, but it was survival. And that was enough to be remembered. For in those times, a child who survived was not just a child. They were proof that God, or chance, or sheer stubbornness could reach into the smallest body and decide to spare it. And when people spoke of them years later, they did not say, that girl, or that boy. They said, the one who lived. And yet, survival was never guaranteed by innocence. A healer's hands could save as often as they could harm, and in that truth lay another kind of story. A healer's touch was always a gamble. Warm hands, steady hands, hands that smelled of vinegar and herbs, sometimes they saved you. Sometimes they ended you quicker than the wound itself. In the Middle Ages, medicine was as much trust as skill, and both could fail. The best healers were remembered like saints. They knew which leaves soothed burns, which roots drew poison, which honey staved off rot. They cut clean, stitched tighter, poured wine in steady streams that stung but did not drown. Their patients lived to tell the tale, and villages whispered their names with reverence. A man with such hands was welcomed at every hearth, given bread, given ale, given thanks that could never truly be repaid. But not all hands were steady. Some shook from drink, or from age, or from too many nights spent in dark rooms with too little light. They missed the vein, fumbled with the needle, tied stitches too loose or too cruel. They pressed herbs that burned instead of soothed, smeared poultices that bred rot instead of killing it. A healer could be a savior or an executioner, and you never knew which until the wound either closed or opened wider. There were stories of men who survived the battlefield only to die under a healer's blade. A barber surgeon digging for an arrow had slipped and nicked a vessel that poured life out faster than war had managed. A woman brought in for childbirth lived long enough to see the midwife's trembling hands bring fever with the cloth instead of safety. Families cursed, but curses changed nothing. The dead were buried, and the healer carried on, because there was no one else to take their place. Trust was forced. You had no choice but to place your body in their care. Rich lords summoned the most praised surgeons, but even then the results varied. Poor men and women had only whoever lived nearby with a basket of roots and a knife. All of them relied on the same truth, that sometimes the body healed not because of what was done to it, but despite it. And so every wound became a test. You watched the hands hovering above your flesh, prayed they were clean, prayed they were steady, prayed they were guided by knowledge rather than guesswork. You clenched your teeth and hoped the stitches would hold, that the herbs would cool instead of burn, that the fever would pass instead of grow. When healing worked, it felt like a miracle. The hands that tied the bandage became the hands that gave you back your life. When it failed, it was just another wound to carry, one made not by war or accident, but by the very person meant to save you. People remembered both kinds. In taverns, men told of the healer who saved a whole troop with nothing but boiled blades and honey. In the same breath, they cursed the one who botched a cut and sent a man into the grave within a day. Hope and fear came together in those stories, because everyone knew they would one day lie beneath such hands themselves. And in the end, survival was never certain. Not from the wound, not from the fever, not from the healer's hands. You lived if the body agreed, if the wound closed, if luck lingered. And when you did live, you never forgot the feeling of those hands on your skin, the ones that pressed life back into you, or the ones that nearly stole it away. And if you did rise again, back to the forge, back to the fields, it was often far too soon. For work waited, even when flesh was not ready. No one waited for you to heal in the Middle Ages. Fields did not pause, animals did not feed themselves, and the forge grew cold if the hammer lay idle. Survival was a race, and once the wound stopped gushing, the world expected you to keep up again. A blacksmith with stitches still fresh at his side leaned over the anvil, sweat already darkening his bandages. Each swing of the hammer pulled the threads tighter, as if the wound itself were protesting. But iron would not wait, and neither would customers. He muttered through clenched teeth, blows ringing out uneven, sparks landing on cloth that smelled faintly of vinegar and dried blood. The wound split open again by dusk, but he bound it tighter and returned the next day. Farmers were no luckier. A man with a broken arm set in splints tried to guide an ox with his good hand, rope burning into his palm, the beast dragging him through mud. Every stumble twisted the fracture until his vision blurred, but spring would not plant itself. Another, with a leg barely mended, hobbled through the furrows on a stick, sowing seeds with each painful step. By harvest, the bone would ache with every motion, but the family would eat. That was the only measure that mattered. Women, too, carried wounds back into work without pause. A mother with cuts still raw across her shoulder leaned over a spinning wheel, thread trembling as she drew it. A widow with ribs cracked from a fall hauled water from the well, each bucket a private torment. Their neighbors nodded but offered no help. Everyone had their own wounds, their own burdens. Pain was not an excuse, it was a condition of living. And there was shame in resting too long. A man who lingered on his pallet wrist whispers, lazy, weak, pretending. Better to limp into the fields, to cough in the forge, to bleed in the barn, than to be thought unwilling. Some even laughed at their own suffering, turning the grimace of pain into a kind of rough humor. Better to die at work, they said, than to rot in bed. It was bravado, but it hid a truth. Poverty punished rest more harshly than wounds ever could. Some paid the price dearly. Stitches tore, bones shifted, fever returned with red streaks up the limb. What might have healed with time instead turned worse, and the man who had forced himself back too soon ended in the grave. But no one truly blamed him. What choice had he? The world did not feed those who lay still. For the lucky, scars thickened, bones knitted crooked but strong enough, and work became possible again. They lived with the pain, folding it into their labor until it was part of every breath. For the unlucky, work cut short the fragile gift of survival, leaving only another pallet to be filled. This was the way of things. A wound was never simply endured in silence. It was carried into the fields, into the markets, into the forges. Every swing of the hammer, every pull of the plow, every drawn bucket was proof that life demanded more than the body had to give. And still, people gave it, because there was no other path. And among them were the rare ones who carried wounds that should have killed them, yet lived on. Not because of herbs, not because of hands, but because of something harder to name, luck, stubbornness, or perhaps just the will to keep walking. Some wounds had no right to heal, and yet they did. A spear through the belly, a crushed skull, an arrow sunk so deep the surgeon gave up searching. There were men and women who should have been buried, but instead walked out of the infirmary one morning, thin and pale, and never quite explained why. People called them the lucky few. Not skilled, not blessed with the best healers, not always rich. Just lucky. The kind of luck that made neighbors shake their heads, half in awe, half in unease. Because survival of that sort did not seem natural. It looked like cheating death, and death never liked being cheated. These were the ones you saw in taverns, scars twisted like maps across their bodies, lifting mugs with hands that trembled but did not fail. They laughed too loudly sometimes, as though to prove to themselves they were still alive. They drank deep, as if ale could drown the memory of fever and rot. And people listened to them, because they had gone to the grave's edge and come back. But luck had its price. The wounds never truly left. The man who survived the gutting never again ate without pain. The one who had his skull trepanned lived with headaches so fierce they bent him double. The woman who endured burns from fire carried skin that never stretched right, cracking each winter until she bled again. Survival was not freedom. It was a contract, signed in pain, renewed every day. Still, they lived. And that alone was enough to make them different. Priests used them as proof of God's will. Villagers pointed them out to children, saying, "See, he should have been gone, and yet here he is." They became walking relics, reminders that not every story ended where it should. Some people staggered past the end and kept going. Sometimes they carried guilt with them. To live when comrades did not was a burden harder than pain. Men sat by the fire, turning mugs in their hands, muttering that they should have been the ones in the ground. Women stared at their children, wondering why they had been spared when others' arms had been emptied. Luck, in the end, was as cruel as it was kind. And yet, the lucky few gave people hope. Their very presence whispered that survival was possible, that death could be delayed, that the body could withstand more than anyone believed. They were proof that flesh was stubborn, that life sometimes clung tighter than it should. In the market you recognized them not just by their scars, but by their eyes. Eyes that had seen fever burn a body from within, that had watched pus bloom and bones splinter, that had smelled the stink of death in the infirmary and walked out into sunlight anyway. Their gaze was both heavy and light at once, as if carrying the weight of the grave while still marveling at the morning air. And as seasons turned, these people aged. Some limped into old age, shaking their heads at the memory of wounds that never should have let them live so long. Others died years later of sickness or hunger, their old scars only footnotes by then. But while they lived, they remained symbols, not of strength alone, not of skill, but of sheer, inexplicable luck. And so the story of medieval survival ended not with the best medicine, not with the sharpest surgeon, not with the most expensive care. It ended with those who were dragged from the mud, stitched, burned, prayed over, poisoned with herbs, fed with honey, and who, against all odds, opened their eyes again the next morning. The lucky few. For in the Middle Ages, survival was never certain. It was not promised by God, not secured by man. It was a coin flipped in the dark, and sometimes, just sometimes, it landed in your favor.